Let's start this one with a question. If you use a virtual instrument as a sound source for your drum parts within your project, such as Groove Agent or Groove Agent SE, how do you then approach the mixing of that drum kit within the project? For example, the ability to apply EQ or dynamics to the snare, that may be different settings that are required for the kick or the cymbals or the hi-hat. Now, your mileage may vary, but for me personally, having got myself familiar with the Cubase Mix Console, I'd rather do all of my mixing work in that one location, including my drum mixing work, rather than dip into the mixing facilities that are built into a VSTI, such as Groove Agent. Those facilities are good, but I'd rather keep all of my mixing work in a single location. Now, if that's something you'd like to explore, it's actually very easy to configure because Cubase allows you to assign multiple audio outputs to most virtual instruments. Let's see how that can be done then, and we'll use Groove Agent SE as an example to explore the possibilities. Let's start with a tiny bit of context. How might we approach drum mixing if we had a multi-mic recording of an actual acoustic drum kit? Now, the project we can see on screen provides a simple example of that. This is a kind of rock track. You can see there are lots of guitars recorded as audio within the project, bass, combination of audio and synth bass, some sound effects, some vocals, and what we've also got is a multi-mic recording of an acoustic drum kit. In this case, it's a fairly simple mic array. There was a single mic on the kick, single mic on the snare, single mic on the hi-hat, and a pair of mics acting as overheads above the drum kit itself. So in total, 5 microphones. And what we get as the end result is that each of those microphones appears as an individual audio track within our Cubase project window, and also, if we flip to the mix console, within the mix console. So a kick mic, a snare mic, and so on. And then what that means is when it comes to mixing this drum kit within the context of the rest of the project, I have access to all of the standard processing options within the mix console that I would have with any other audio track in my project. So I can apply separate EQ, compression, saturation and so on to my kick sound, to my snare sound, to my hi-hat sound and to my overhead mics, as well as obviously being able to easily balance the levels of those different elements of the kit using the channel faders. So the mixing of all parts of the drum kit is therefore approached alongside all the other elements of the mix and using the same mix console tools. By default, the situation is somewhat different when we use a virtual instrument as our drum sound source. So here we are within a simple, this is actually a Cubase Elements project, but the same would apply in other versions of Cubase. And I've got an instance of Groove Agent SE installed as a virtual instrument track with a MIDI part to drive this particular drum performance. In this particular example, I've simply picked one of the acoustic agent presets to use within Groove Agent. Now, if we flip to the mix console, what we can see here is we have a single stereo channel for that virtual instrument, and our drum mix arrives at that channel before being blended in with the rest of our project. So just one stereo channel within the mix console that delivers all of the drum sounds from Groove Agent SE in this case, pre-mixed and as configured within the Groove Agent SE preset that I might have selected. Now, sometimes that might be all you need, and if so, job done. However, if you need to adjust the drum mix, you then have 2 possible ways you can do it. You can dip into the Groove Agent mixing features, which work absolutely fine, or you can configure Groove Agent or Groove Agent SE in this case to use multiple outputs and to deliver each drum kit element to an individual channel within the mix console. And with the latter, you then end up with a mixing workflow all in one place, and that more closely mirrors that experienced with an actual multi-mic drum recording, as in the example we looked at a few minutes ago. Now, your mileage may vary, but I prefer the latter workflow, doing all of my mixing work in one location within the main Cubase Mix Console. So if that's something you'd also like to try, let's see how we set it up. Let's start by taking a quick peek at Groove Agent's own mixing features. And if we click the little mix icon, we can open the mixer display at the bottom of the Groove Agent window. Now, in this particular preset example that I've got loaded, we can see a number of different mixer channels for the kicks, snare, toms, hi-hat, percussion, and cymbals. There's also channels for the overheads and for room microphones in this particular case. Do note that things are actually more complex than they might at first appear. And also the level of complexity varies between the acoustic agent presets and the beat agent kit presets. So we've got an acoustic agent preset configured here, but if I click on this channel list here, what you can see is actually there is a kick main, a kick add, a snare top, a snare bottom, individual channels for the various toms, channels for individual elements of the percussion. We've got a cowbell channel, claps channel, tambourine, multiple channels for the various cymbals. And within Groove Agent itself, many of those individual channels are blended down to create the channels that we can see here within the mixer display. So for example, the snare top and the snare bottom channels have been blended, and their output arrives at what is essentially a snare bus here within Groove Agent's mixer display. Same thing applies for the kick, where there's multiple microphones on the kick, or multiple microphones that contribute to this cymbal bus that you can see within the mix console display. You can, of course, use the various mixing options that are provided here. If you want to, you can open an additional effects panel and you can see and add effects to the different elements of the drum kit. Equally, you can see and adjust the individual effects for particular channels. So we've got the kick channel here and you can see the effects that are applied to that, and you've got access to the detailed control set. But as I've said, I would prefer to do all of that effects processing, to do all of that detailed kit mixing work over in the mix console, an environment I'm familiar with and where I'm doing all of my other mixing work. However, seeing this mix console layout within Groove Agent is useful because it gives us a very simple guide that we can follow when we come to configure the multiple outputs from Groove Agent to the Cubase mix console. Okay, so if we want to go down the multi-output route, we have two options. There is a quick automatic way that uses a feature known as Export Mixer to Cubase that's built into Groove Agent and is available in Cubase 10 or later. Or there is a manual way. Now that's still pretty quick, but for me it produces a much neater end result within the mix console. Now I prefer that manual approach, and that's what I'm going to walk through first, but I will show you the automatic way at the end of the video, and then you can take your pick. So let's start with that more personalized manual approach to this task. We can break it down into a number of steps. The first step is simply to activate a suitable number of outputs within Groove Agent, and this is where our Groove Agent mix layout can provide us with a guide. We've got 6 individual drum element channels here, and then 2 further channels for the overheads and the room mics. So what we're going to do then is configure 8 outputs from Groove Agent. Now you do that via the drop-down menu at the top right. Scroll down to Activate Outputs, and you can then choose to activate all the outputs. Again, that's very quick and easy to do, but you end up with a lot of additional channels that you don't need. Or you simply activate additional outputs individually until you got a total of 8. And that's what I'm going to do here. First output is already activated. Let's activate the second one. And simply repeat the process until you've got the required number of outputs activated, in this case 8. If we now flip to the mix console, we can now see these multiple output channels coming from Groove Agent represented within our mix console. And our second step is a pragmatic one. It's simply to label the mix console channels to match the labels that we can see within Groove Agent itself. Step 3 is perhaps an optional one, and that's to set up a group channel as a drum bus within our mix console. That's something I would routinely do in configuring my mix console anyway. So let's add a group channel, send it to my master bus. We'll call it drum bus. We then need to go back to the mix console, select our various individual drum channels from Groove Agent, enable quick link, and send them all to our drum bus, and to make sure that the drum bus is then going onwards to the master bus or stereo output. Our fourth step back in Groove Agent SE is to assign each of the Groove Agent mixer channels to the required output to match the configuration in the main mix console. Now this is very easy to do. At the top of each channel, you simply drop down the option to select an output, and while it's a shame you don't see the mix console labels here, we can simply assign them in order. To each of the outputs. Step 5, we simply flip back to the main mix console, trigger playback and watch the drum channels light up. You can then solo each channel in turn to ensure that you've got the outputs allocated correctly. And once you're happy with the output configuration, step 6, you simply start drum processing and mixing within the mix console alongside all the other elements of your mix, and you can set aside the mixing features that are offered within Groove Agent itself. Well, sort of. There is, however, one further issue to consider. If you remember, back in Groove Agent, there were some pre-existing effects that were applied to the various kit elements within the Groove Agent preset. Those effects are still being applied. As the signal is sent out from the kick channel, for example, it passes through the studio EQ, through the tape saturator, through the vintage compressor, before it reaches the kick channel of our mix console. So if I was to solo the kick for a moment, and then bypass these effects, you'll hear the sound change. So the additional thing that you do need to consider is, do you simply leave these effects in place, or do you bypass them and do your own thing in terms of processing within the mix console? Now, either approach works. You could still apply additional processing, further EQ and compression moves, for example, within the main mix console, leaving these effects in place if you wish. I prefer to simply bypass all of these effects, or you can, of course, simply delete them, and then I will get a quick start for each of my main drum channels by simply loading a suitable preset, and then use those settings as a starting point, allowing me to dial in from there using all the familiar mix console tools, including the channel settings window. And we've now completed the process. Our multiple outputs from Groove Agent are now set up and configured. We have individual channels for each of the main drum kit elements within our main mix console, ready to start mixing work within our overall project. So I said I would come back to the automatic way in which you can configure these multiple audio outputs from Groove Agent using the Export Mixer to Cubase option that you can find within Groove Agent itself. I've now simply returned this project back to its original state. We've got our single instance of Groove Agent. If we go to the mix console, we have got all of the Groove Agent output arriving within the main Cubase mix console in one stereo audio channel. All of our drum mixing work would now need to be done within the Groove Agent mix console. Now you can find this automatic configuration of the multiple outputs within Groove Agent. If you right click on the preset name that you've got loaded within Groove Agent, you've got a couple of options here. Export Mixer to Cubase Elements, bypassing the local effects, that's the effects that are built into Groove Agent itself, or Export Mixer to Cubase Elements, keeping the local effects. And you can execute either of these with a single click. Now, the pros to this process is it's a one-action task. It sets up all of the channels for you, and bear in mind that can include a lot of individual channels that will get created within your mix console, depending on what preset you've got loaded within Groove Agent. Now, the two main cons, firstly, again, you get a lot of channels created within your main mix console, but secondly, it doesn't actually do a great job of transferring all of the effects that exist within the Groove Agent preset. And that's particularly true of any of the processing options that have been embedded in what are essentially these group channels for your individual drum instruments. So any of the effects that are applied here which in the acoustic agent are probably the most important of the effects in terms of shaping the drum mix that you hear from Groove Agent, these effects do not get transferred as part of this simple export mixer to Cubase process. Incidentally, if Steinberg were to resolve that issue and to add an additional option or two within this export mixer to Cubase feature that allows you to export these bus level effects within the Groove Agent mixing system, then this would be a much more useful feature to use. Anyway, let's show an example. I'm simply going to export mixer to Cubase elements, keeping the local effects, hit the option. We can see instantly that that process has added a number of, in fact, what they are audio buses to our project window. Reposition those group channels for a moment within my project window layout. Then I flip to the mix console. You can see the process has created a large number of individual channels, and it's here we can see now we're getting the snare top, the snare bottom. If we play back for a minute, hear the snare top mic or the snare bottom mic, the main kick mic, additional kick mic, and we've got the buses where, for example, the various kick mics are combined or the various snare mics are combined. So what we created with our manual process that we went through a few minutes ago was essentially the equivalent of these channels here that the automatic process has created, but it's also generated for us a whole bunch of individual drum microphone channels that, for me personally at least, are perhaps overkill. Again, it may be a more detailed arrangement that you actually prefer. If so, that's great. I simply prefer to do the manual process. I end up with something that, for me at least, feels like a much neater, more manageable end result that allows me to do all of my main mixing work for my drum kit on a smaller, compact set of channels. However, to point out to you the one key thing to notice, these are the Groove Agent bus channels that we have just now exported to the Cubase mix console as these group channels within the main mix console. Within Groove Agent, they already had effects applied. Those effects do not get exported to the main Cubase mix console by that automatic process. So when you arrive at the Cubase mix console to do your drum mixing, you are still starting from scratch. So you have two methods that you can use to configure these multiple outputs from Groove Agent to the Cubase console. There's the automatic process or the manual process we went through a few minutes ago. The choice is yours. Either way, you now have full control over the individual drum elements when it comes to the mixing stage of your project, all within the main Cubase mix console. And for me at least, when it comes to the mixing stage of a project, I find that to be a big plus. Multiple audio outputs are something that can be configured here within Cubase for almost any virtual instrument, but they make particular sense when it comes to a drum virtual instrument such as Groove Agent. So I hope you found this little walkthrough and example useful, and it'll give you some ideas to explore in your own projects. Incidentally, the process that we've just walked through would work in exactly the same fashion if you were using a third-party drum instrument such as Toontrack's Easy Drummer. Anyway, if you enjoy this kind of Cubase related content, do subscribe to the channel, hit the bell notification icon to get notified of future videos. Please also check out the links in the video description below for some further Cubase content, articles in Sound on Sound magazine, for example, or my full Cubase Essentials course that's available via the Udemy platform. Thanks very much for watching, and until next time, I hope you enjoy getting some music made.